intergovernmental relations, 25 years since devolution, and today we have a couple of former First Ministers and a former Lord Advocate, and I think we're all very interested and excited about their appearances. And first off is former First Minister, the Right Honourable Henry McLeish, who I'll now allow to introduce himself and anything by way of a short introductory statement. Mr McLeish.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and can I thank the members of the committee for the invitation to speak to you. I was 15 years in this place. I enjoyed the place. It was a very special political space, and delighted to be back speaking to the committee. I was First Minister in 2000. After the death of Donald Dewar, we were elected in, well, not elected, we were elected in 97, and of course we pushed on with devolution, and of course tragically after we established the Parliament, Donald Dewar died, and in the aftermath of that I was selected, it's a sensitive word these days, but selected by the party to become put forward as First Minister, and that's what I did. So, Chair, after the brief discussion, helpful discussion we had outside, what I'd like to try and do is very briefly focus on some of my experiences rather than give you the narrative of that you may have probably heard before and probably will hear again, and that may alleviate some of the concerns of the committee. The first point was that in 1997, when we were elected, it was an incredible year. I don't mean because of a Labour victory, but in terms of devolution, we had a situation in that year where it ended the year with the first reading of the Scotland Bill. It was preceded by a campaign, a referendum campaign, interrupted by the tragic death of Princess Diana. We had a referendum bill go through this House, with a referendum enacted, and there was a whole range of issues which meant we were entirely focused, and to use a phrase that's been used in another more bizarre situation, we wanted to make Devo work. So in that context, we were focused on that, and a remarkable achievement. But in that process, I'm conscious now looking back that talking about machinery between governments and parliaments was not really on the agenda. I mean, we were conscious that if you set up other institutions, then you've got to have some relational framework that makes that work. So it was discussed prior to the election. It was discussed post the election. But I think in the drive to get this legislation enacted and taken through, it may not have been given. And the reason I say that is I want to then jump right to the end, which is now, because it seems to me in the last few years, the lack of possibly legally underpinned framework has resulted in what we've had over the last 4 years, where what we've seen is not the progress of two parliaments, but the battle, in my view, between unionism and nationalism. And we've seen a situation where it vexes me, but this is the reality, I think, that the government from Mr Johnson onwards, there was just simply a lack of respect, a lack of the potential that devolution has. And in that context, that was one side of it. But then we had a situation in Scotland where the SNP government were very keen, if I could use the phrase, to mix it, not knowing whether it was a public policy issue of importance to Scotland, not knowing whether it was just a one-upmanship over Westminster, or whether indeed it was a battle of ideologies or philosophies. But nonetheless, none of that made any sense to me, and it kind of was the extreme end of where I started. And let me go back there. When I was First Minister, and I want to tag it to this row that's going on just now about the Secretary of State and the Foreign Office wanting to tell the Scottish Government that they should have someone in the room, as it were, a kind of nannying. When I was First Minister, we had some remarkable developments, all with the consent of the Foreign Office. And at that time, of course, Robin Cook was the Foreign Secretary. So now we're debating 25 years on whether we should do this and that. So I was the first person to be invited to the White House for a 45-minute session with the President. And that was fixed up through our embassy in Washington and the ambassador with no particular problems. George W. Bush took a lot of time in that to discuss not only Scotland but some other policy issues. Secondly, we had Hu Jintao, who went on to become the president of China. He came to Edinburgh and I hosted him for 2 days. We had a situation where John Reid, who was the Secretary of State at that time for Scotland, him and I went to have a private meeting with Pope John Paul, the first Scottish leaders in 500 years to visit the Vatican in that context. And in that sense, we had Thabo Mbeki, President of South Africa. So, good relationship at that time, similar parties, of course, with the Liberals involved with us, made, first of all, any problem we had, and there was one great problem emerged about a real stushy with the press in Scotland. Tom McKay, one of my finance minister, had used the phrase that Scotland was a government, a Scottish government. And of course the press went absolutely wild. A Scottish government? No, get back into your trap, you're an executive. So I picks up the phone and I phones Tony Blair. I says, look, Prime Minister, as far as Scotland's concerned, devolved matters, we are the Scottish government. Fine. How's the weather? Press the next day, gone. So that degree of networking was absolutely solid in relation to developing where we were in Scotland.
We're going to get into all these themes, and thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. Some of the international work that was done in the early days of devolution was fantastic, and I think we'll still see the benefits of that. But you had a very unusual and unique position in the whole story of devolution, because you were the minister that effectively took the Scotland Bill through. I mean, I think we see it, like I know Donald gets credited with like signing it all off and doing the big statements, and like obviously being credited with devolution. But it was Henry McLeish that was there at the dispatch box dealing with all the amendments and getting the bill through. I looked at some of the debate from that period, fascinating, and I encourage colleagues to do it. I'm pretty certain that they have, because it was really an interesting part of Scottish political history. There was very little talk about intergovernmental relations at all. I mean, I was struggling to find any references to this, to any discussion that went on in the House during that point. Was I looking in the wrong places? Did this feature at all in the construction of the Act? And should more attention be paid at that point in the devolution journey?
I think the answer to the last point is yes. But the context at that time was it wasn't done. Nobody had kind of raised it as a major issue. And I think that I spent 108, 110 hours on the floor of the House dealing with the issues. And you're right, I can't recall somebody standing up and saying, well, hang on a minute, when this is completed, what's the machinery for working together? On the other hand, let me say that Donald Dewar put in an enormous amount of work. And I think intellectually as well, that if we had felt at that point there was going to be trouble ahead, or difficulties ahead, it may have forced us in a way to give it more credence, the intergovernmental machinery, which we didn't.
I think it was maybe looking back now, and you obviously characterise your own way and how you observe current relationships. Should we possibly at that point had more time allocated to looking at intergovernmental machinery at that very stage of setting out the Act?
I think so, Chair. But I think one of the interesting points is, and I don't want to, it's an all-party committee, and I don't want to be accused of being partisan, but there was a different feel in different parts of the chamber. Some of the Conservatives were thinking this is the last thing on earth they wanted to be involved in, so there was just a kind of forget it. I then had a situation where one critic from Scotland. He was really the opposition, and he asked tons of questions about a great deal of things. The SNP were quiet, the Lib Dems, and so therefore it was only occasionally there was a bit of a rumpus, but nobody was pressing for that issue. And it's the great benefit of hindsight now that if that had happened, it would have been beneficial. It might not have had to be used in the early years, and Jack McConnell will tell you about his years, but nevertheless, in terms of the process of building devolution, building new parliaments, new governments, it's something now that would have stood us in good stead at this point, where relations, in my judgment, between Westminster and Holyrood have reached rock bottom.
And I know we've not got much time with you, so I'll just given you brought this up, and I'm just interested myself about your views on all this. You mentioned the McCabe intervention and the call about describing the Scottish executive as it was then as a government. Of course, famously, we've now got the White Heather bar in the Scottish Parliament in tribute to that particular intervention. But did you detect, when you were First Minister, did you detect a sort of resistance amongst particularly Labour colleagues down there who thought you were maybe getting ahead of yourself, that you were maybe getting overexcited about the Scottish Parliament? And we've always heard about good relationships, which there were obviously between Labour colleagues in Edinburgh and Scotland, but was there a little bit that some of the colleagues down here were maybe trying to drag you back down a little bit? And who do they think they are type attitude?
You're clearly prized with too much mischievous information, Chair. Yes, I mean, one of the great problems about devolution has been, in my judgment, that it was essentially to strengthen governance in the UK as well as giving Scotland a voice and all of what went with it. But in some people's minds, this is it has been historically highly centralised, highly exceptional, very jealous of the legislative capabilities, in my view, quite delusional at times. But nevertheless, there was a very powerful view here that devolution was peripheral. And what then happened was a situation where you were always being slightly tested about how Scottish you wanted to be with a Labour ticket. And I didn't find that a problem. I played for my country at football, and that wasn't really an issue. But the Tom McCabe illustration was one where the media were quite febrile in the early period of devolution. And they were always looking, God bless them, for some controversy. And Tom McCabe, without flickering, had just made that comment, which seemed common sense. And you're Chair, well aware that just became a huge issue, but stopped in its tracks because of the common sense of both sides in extrapolation. So, and that kind of issue in Scotland has not disappeared, Chair. Within parties, between parties, there is still a question about, whether the devolution years stopped in 2014 after the referendum, and we started really with the independence years. So there's a bit of banter that could take place on that, but my serious point is that unless each of the institutions respects and trusts each other, you can have all the constitutional machinery in the world, and it still won't work if it's fixated in the minds of those involved that this is a second-class, in some people's eyes, Parliament. We used to be the Empire's Parliament. We are now this. We're out of Brexit. We're doing this, then that. And if I could be really provocative, that kind of arrogance within the House here, it does not stand devolution in good stead, and I'm afraid it alienates people who are not as well disposed to this House as I am.
And just lastly, of course, today we've got a new member to the ex-First Ministers Club, and the feature of Mr Yousaf. And there's only been 6 First Ministers in the 25 years. I think a lot of people look at the history of devolution as just been a little bit more, like fractious than that. I mean, I don't know if you've got any particular advice for the new First Minister, as he's probably going to be maybe already installed in position as a former First Minister yourself.
Well, let's make a play for bipartisanship. I mean, I think that's where politics in this place and politics in Scotland and politics in democracy should be going. I have great respect for John Swinney. I worked with him, and in fact, I think way back in the early years of the Parliament, he and I got a joint award from the Herald for being the parliamentarians that were most interested in creating some unity of purpose. So I wish him well, and it's a tough job at any time, and of course he's picking up his party where they've had certain problems to face. But it's this trust and tolerance that's got to be a key part of the new politics. Now, if I could make one point, when I was here, I thought that part of the bill, part of the act, part of the process would be to create a new politics. That simply hasn't happened. And that level of tribalism that you experience here is alive and well in Edinburgh.
Thank you ever so much. I'll pass it over to Christine Jardine. Christine.
Thank you very much, Mr McLeish. I was listening to what you're saying. Great interest about the fact that the machinery didn't really seem to matter. The intergovernmental machinery didn't seem to figure in the discussions, if I picked you up correctly.
Well, I wouldn't say mattered. I think what I've said on reflection, it should have mattered, but I think at that point it was just not an agenda item.
Sorry, yes.
No,
yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you think that Was the Joint Ministerial Committee machinery set up in 1999 thought to be the final product? Was it sort of imagined then that that would be the final product? Or was there an expectation that somehow machinery would just evolve over time?
I think the latter point you make is a good one. But, of course, between 1997 and 2007, when Jack McConnell's period finished, it was all playing with the same players in north and south of the border. And I think it was only after that point, when Alex Allen became First Minister, that I then began to think myself that the lack of some robust machinery could be detrimental to Scotland as we evolved. So I'm being quite honest in saying that during the early years from 97, it wasn't a high point. It was discussed, but not sufficiently to try and create a kind of labyrinth of checks and balances to make it work.
Just to go back, if you don't mind, to something you said earlier. You talked about how in the early years of devolution there were lots of foreign visits. You yourself went to the White House and nobody thought anything very much about it. Whereas now it's much more controversial. To what extent do you think the lack of having anticipated that and paid sufficient attention to machinery and leaving it to evolve has led to the situation where now that we have two institutions which are very much more in competition than perhaps they were in 97. In 97, Holyrood was looked on as a huge achievement. It was about devolution. And you mentioned yourself the independence years. And it's become much more competitive and more about the Scottish Parliament trying to establish itself as something perhaps wasn't originally envisaged with devolution. Do you think that's undermined the relationship?
Well, I'm very ambitious for Scotland, within the confines of my own party. And I've made the comment that I think over the last 4 years in particular, and that coincides with the Johnson years and Truss years, Sunak years, this level of kind of disrespect and people being uncomfortable with the relationship is costing Scotland. I mean, I think Scotland is not progressing. But coming back to the point that you've made, that and coming back to that mattered, I mean, the benefit of hindsight is it did matter. And when I talked about the White House, it wasn't to give you a kind of, tour of where I had been, but it was fascinating nevertheless. But it was just effortless. And I think that may have lulled us into a kind of false sense that it'll always be like this. We'll have the new politics, everybody will trust and have tolerance with each other, and etc. And that didn't transpire. So you're absolutely right to say that maybe more cognizance should have been given. And the reason I raised the spat between the Secretary of State and the powers that be in Holyrood is that it seems like a ridiculous item that a country like Scotland, a nation, with a functioning parliament, shouldn't be able to say, well, we're doing this, we're doing that. And just give one example, just to pinpoint that. When Robin Cook was the Foreign Secretary, and Robin sadly died not long after this, that we had a situation where we were about to sign an 11 sub-nation or sub-state document in Brussels. So the civil servants had been giving our civil servants a really rough time. No, you can't do this, you can't do that. So I just phoned Robin and says, look, Robin, could you help? No problem. 10 minutes later, done. And we're in Brussels. But now it's quite clear that we maybe should have thought of the machinery.
Do you think that's interesting, because that illustrates something that we heard from earlier witnesses, that during the early years with the Liberal Democrat Labour coalition, the relationship with Westminster was much smoother. And perhaps that was to do with having the same party in power in two places. And perhaps more credence should have been given to the idea that one day you might have, as we have now, parties who are in competition. And that ease of relationship came more from a sort of same party relationship. And we didn't give enough credence to that.
Well, I mean, that's the kind of basis of, I suppose, the discussion we're having. I mean, I didn't think that anybody, well, let me rephrase, that at that point where devolution was happening, 97 onwards, 99, the new Parliament, there was such a hope, I think, that, this was a different development. But, reality being reality, once 2007 arrived, it may well be that Scots had interpreted what we were doing at Westminster in a completely different way. And that's reflected, Chair, and to yourself, as from 2007, hugely electoral successful, the SNP. But here's a Scotland now that's stalled, a country's more divided than it's been in the last 25 years, and the issue of independence, in my judgment, solely my judgment, is simply going nowhere. So could we have envisaged any of that? Not really, and so therefore that's part of the exciting journey of devolution, is that we are where we are. But I do think there's an opportunity now, with all of that that's happened, to reset where devolution might be, especially at a time where Scotland needs to go forward rather than remain, in my judgment, stagnant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Eco Shanks.
Just reflecting on some of that, because there seems to be a bit of a contradiction in some of the evidence, not just from yourself, but from everyone who's spoken to us about, maybe we should have thought about the machinery more, but at the same time, actually, if there isn't mutual trust and respect, it doesn't matter what the machinery is, it's not going to work anyway. Isn't the reality that this is about people and about relationships and about politics getting in the way, and actually if we had more machinery, it might still have not made much of a difference?
Yes, as a proposition that could be true, but my view is that we need some rules of the game now, and we don't have any, and we've had incidents. If I'm a kind of ex-politician and I see a public policy issue end up in the Supreme Court or in the courts of Scotland, then democracy's failed. And that could be other sides, both sides, 3 sides, 4 sides, if it's possible, to blame. So I think that there's no dichotomy here. I think that you need rules of the game if players are behaving badly. And I'm talking about in the Scottish Parliament now, things are not as good as they should be. And the idea of opposition for the sake of it, I think, should have died out. On the other hand, you're right. My concern now is that the depths of division between the Conservative government and the SNP government are such that you can create all the rules in the world, but if you have a mind not to adhere or to implement or to respect, and this is why I come back a bit naively, I'm an ex-politician now, so I could be a naive ex-politician, is that the politics has got to change. It's so incredibly unproductive that everybody, it used to be in the past that I would have political opponents, but now you must have a political enemy. Before I start to eulogise Chair on that kind of issue, you're right, this is the contradiction at the heart of politics, but I still am inspired by the idea of a better politics where we discuss policies and issues, we don't go for them personally, we actually go for the policies.
In terms of some of the machinery of that, so I think I'm right in saying that there were more joint ministerial committees during your time in office than subsequently, although I think the one on Europe started meeting quite a lot not long after that. But did you find those productive? Were they helpful? Did you resolve issues, or were they just formalities?
The latter, but very enjoyable, because here you were speaking to people from Northern Ireland and the Welsh, and of course the Scots, and then you had Westminster. And that was a revelation in a way, that you were sitting beside people that you had only heard about on television. You were actually beginning to build up a wider understanding. But more importantly, for a union that wants to survive, you were learning what's happening in other parts of the union. Because I think in England it's exactly the same. We're quite parochial about our own nations. The number of Scots who should be doing this, the number of English who should be doing that. And so the joint ministerial committees were simply an opportunity to get together, understand difference, respect difference, and just see what was happening in other devolved responsibilities.
And I asked your successor after Jack, Alex Salmond, this question about, do you think as devolution has developed, First Ministers have started to see their equal more as the Prime Minister rather than anyone else in the government? And if that's the case, is there a risk that kind of lower level coordination through joint ministerial things starts to fall away because it becomes something for a big summit rather than just kind of getting down and battering out the detail. Do you think that has changed, or did you view your equal as Tony Blair rather than the Secretary of State?
No, I mean, look, Alex Salmond's a unique character. I mean, I don't think he'll find an equal easily in many places, so let's leave it there. But the point, no, I mean, I think it seems to me a bit of humility is involved, because, I mean, devolution, you know, the narrative was an exciting one. It should have given all of us enough to get on with without pretending that we want to be the Prime Minister or we were this and we were that. And I don't think to any real extent has that taken over. Where I do think there's a problem is that in terms of the reserved and devolved issues, you know, the basis of the Act, if you want to adhere to that, then that's the rule of the game. But recently, there's been some legislation in the Scottish Parliament which is bordering on, and it's been proven in terms of legal cases. So I think you've just got to watch that you don't go into this and pretend you want a battle, as I said earlier, so that it's either one-upmanship or we're doing it in Scotland, so we must be better. Because this idea for me is that I'm a very proud, passionate, ambitious Scot. But in many respects, I'm not a narrow nationalist who would seek to engage other institutions. Now, that's only my hypothesis. People completely differ with that. But on the other hand, that's where you could look to rules. But if the attitudes are not right and the trust is not there, they may not count for anything.
Can I ask just one last question on that note? I think you and I both would describe ourselves as devolutionists, certainly rather than unionists, and you've spoken there about nationalism. And I think you said earlier there is at the moment this problem between muscular nationalism, muscular unionism butting itself together. If there's a change in government this year and there's more of a willingness to make devolution work, what do you think could be the key elements of trying to make that work? What is it, mechanics, or is it policy, or is it, or actually is there a danger that as long as the question of independence remains the priority of one part of that, we're always going to have this conflict?
Well, I mean, I think we're treading into kind of cultural issues, issues of identity. I mean, identity politics is rampant in America, it's happening in Europe, etc. And my fear is that we dwell down on the negative, which is, in my judgment, the unionism versus nationalism bit. You know, I've often been criticised from my own party about being too close to wanting Scotland to do well. I never thought that would be a problem for any politician. But on the other hand, what we've got now is kind of silos where, in some respects, I believe that devolution should be rewritten to make it attractive. And we used to make the point, Chair, and Donald Dewar made the point, and I made the point, that we always thought it was a process, devolution. But if it's a process, it's never going to have an end. So what I'm advocating for devolution now is it's more than a process, it's a product, with all the hallmarks that could have to compete with independence, if that's what you want to have. But my bigger concern is that there are so many areas where Scotland should be doing better. There are so many good people in all the political parties that should be doing better together. And so why cannot, in a naive way, say that we don't need to have this pitched battle between unionism and nationalism, nation build in Scotland first, and at some point in the future, with no crystal ball, there may be decisions to be made on a more sounder footing.
Thank you. Thank you. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for being here today. So I'm going to reverse the questions in the way I was going to answer them, because Michael said there and described himself as a devolutionist. I would probably describe myself as a federalist first and foremost, and I'll not speak for Christine Jardine, but we probably might be in the same place. Is part of the challenge that we are facing with devolution about the fact that across the UK there has been real difference in the devolution that's been delivered, particularly in England?
Yes, but I don't think that could have been avoided in a way. I mean, if you take, I mean, even the situation, you know, the Welsh joined in mid-1560s, the Irish joined in 1801, left in 1922, the Welsh, well, that's 1560s. Now you've got Scotland coming in, and then now you've got in England, you know, metropolitan mayors. That's another form of devolution that they're talking about. So I think making progress at different times at different rates was always going to happen. On the other hand, it seems to me that it's all moving not away from Westminster, but it's actually each of these events is saying to Westminster, look, and you go back to the Union of the Crowns in 1603, you got the Union of the Parliaments in 1707. And my novel idea just now is, well, why not have a Union of the Nations? Because we don't have a Union of the Nations just now. We ostensibly have a parliamentary system which has been devolved, but we don't have that kind of wider thinking. So I just believe that there's a way forward to unite. I mean, Gordon Brown has talked about the fact that you can get rid of the House of Lords now. In my judgment, that would be a sensible step, but that ain't going to happen. So it's how you can tie all that, having less centralisation at Westminster, moving that out, but making some sense the four nations involved. And of course, Northern Ireland is presenting some particular problems, and of course you've got this situation in the Republic where there might be some border discussions there. So the Union seems to be in a state of flux, and I think it's time that we actually look in a different way at how it can evolve.
I suppose some ways you can argue that that's been one of the strengths of the UK, in that it's always been able to cope with that flux and change. But I suppose at a very practical level for me is some of the challenge or some of the opportunities for discord being brought about by the fact that we have here at Westminster an institution that is still pretty centralised from an English perspective, particularly when you think about health, education and other things like that.
No, I mean, it's far be it from me to be kind of delving in English issues, but I mean, it seems to me there's the prospect of a greater degree of administrative, bureaucratic, whatever kind of devolution in England without necessarily the nations, but a lot of the older parts of England have enormous history and customs and cultures that should be recognised. But if I could be rather pointed, I mean, one of the things that concerns me, which I try and write a lot about, is that Westminster needs to change. You know, I mean, it's such a simple idea, but it needs more flexibility. It needs to be saying, look, why shouldn't Scots or the Welsh or the Irish or whatever, or Andy Burnell in Manchester be doing things that, okay, if it's successful and it complements to the Union in its totality, that's fine. But this, to me, Chair, is the question where I go back to that, you know, the early debates in this place, in this House, in the 1870s, were all about Irish Home Rule, but also about the empire. You know, Scotland was maybe going to end up like Toronto or Mumbai as the kind of, you know, to give the Mother of Parliament some time to breathe, it was doing too much, etc., etc. It then went through a phase, and it got to the 60s, and it was only in the 70s we started to talk about devolution seriously. In the 60s, the struggle was actually how Scotland was described in this place. And I've gone through the manifestos. It was a kind of, well, it's Northern Britain, it's Northern this, etc. So, with great respect to the institution, it's got to change in terms of its attitude, in terms of its thinking, in terms of its trust, and in terms of the highly centralised nature of it. If that happened, then I'd like to think that there might be some corresponding changes in the way that we're going forward.
You mentioned there about obviously previous debates in this place. Just thinking about the fact that what we've heard very strongly is about the machinery of government, but also the need for the personalities, etc. Do you think it was helpful for the fact that both yourself and Donald Dewar had been Scotland Office ministers here at Westminster and then took on roles in the Scottish Parliament and Executive, in that you knew where your lanes were and to stay in it?
Yes, I think that's largely true. I mean, Donald Dewar was a very impressive figure because he not only understood, you know, the laws of this, but he understood Scottish needs. You know, he was a person that I admired because he read newspapers from the back page, which is the sports page forward, and he and Gordon Brown share that distinction. So he had all these really amazing qualities. But with Scotland, the trouble has always been that, and I'm just going on a limb here, that I don't think we have enough competence in ourselves in Scotland. You know, I think there's a temptation, as we've seen in recent times, that, you know, the scapegoating of Westminster or vice versa, whatever, what is that all about? And I think if we don't actually believe in what we're doing, and that's why I think a cell of devolution shouldn't hamper people who want independence or whatever, but it's actually saying at this moment in time, maybe there's a better way to look at the fortunes of Scotland and take them on and see what transpires in the future.
And then my final question, thank you, it was just in relation to the civil service. It's not just about the personalities of individuals who held political office, it's also about the civil servants who have prior to devolution were obviously part of the UK government and then became part of the Scottish government. Again, do you think that there has been a loss of something by the fact that we now have civil servants who haven't served potentially elsewhere?
Well, I always remain having great respect for the civil service, and I always thought they were very flexible. But as I found when we were dealing with that Robin Cook issue in Europe, they're part of the history, and and I hate to be fair to them. It's a proud history, so why shouldn't they be? So I think that the civil service in Scotland, I think, has done a good job. I mean, I was just going to quote earlier, Chair, when we were talking about where we were in terms of 3 tiers and other things, and the House of Commons library in here is just the gem of the world, equal to the one in Washington. And we've got a spin-off from that in Scotland, Spice, with some excellent people from here, but also develop some people up there. So I don't think that the civil servants, I don't think that. But what you do need, though, and this is maybe more required in the Scottish Parliament, you need the politicians to know what they want.
I'm going to have to unfortunately leave it. We're going to listen all afternoon to you, Henry, and thank you ever so much for giving us your time. And I think you said that there was some other stuff that you may be able to usefully give us for part of this inquiry, and we'll readily accept if you've got any further thoughts about this particular issue. But it's been fascinating listening to you today, and the history all the way through from your time on the Scotland Bill to your time as First Minister and your views on current conditions and situations in Scotland. So thank you for today. What we're going to do, we're going to adjourn for a few minutes till we get Lady Elish online, and we'll take it up from there. So order.
Thanks very much, Chairman.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Welcome back to the Scottish Affairs Committee, and we are now joined by Lady Elish Angiolini, who was our Lord Advocate between 2006 and 2011. I think it's really important we get the view from our law officers as we look at the 25 years of devolution and the current conditions of intergovernmental relations. So please, Lady Elish, introduce yourself, and anything by way of a short introductory statement would be acceptable. Thank you.
My name is Elish Angiolini. I'm currently the Principal of St Hugh's College at the University of Oxford, and have been here for the last 12 years. I'm also Chair of a public inquiry into the murder of Sarah Everard by the police officer Wayne Cousins, and the wider issues regarding policing from that. So that's my current activities. I was a Procurator Fiscal in Scotland, public prosecutor, and it also encompassed the role of coroner. We don't have a coroner in Scotland, and investigated sudden unexpected deaths and conducted fatal accident inquiries in that capacity. Having been a civil servant and prosecutor for many years in Scotland, I was appointed as Solicitor General for Scotland, which was wholly unexpected, and that was by the Liberal Labour coalition. And I think I was in that role for a number of years before Lord Boyd was elevated to the bench as a judge, and I then was appointed as Lord Advocate, again by the Labour Liberal coalition. There was thereafter an election in which they were not successful, and I was then kept on, interestingly, by the Scottish National Party in the minority government that they formed at that stage. And I then continued for another number of, I think, 4 or 5 years as Lord Advocate in that capacity.
Thank you ever so much. And you have a particularly fascinating role in the story of devolution of the past 25 years, as you said, Solicitor General and Lord Advocate for two different First Ministers from two very different political parties. And of course, the office of Lord Advocate was created out of the Scotland Act, out of the old Lord Advocate position, which goes back to almost medieval times. I'm just wondering, from your elevated position and your experience in the course of the last couple of decades, what have you made of intergovernment relations from your office between the UK and the Scottish Government? When you look at how the relationships are extended, how they've been formed and forged, what is your view about how they've worked?
I had the benefit of being a trainee solicitor, and therefore the first Lord Advocate I ever got a chance to work for was Lord Mackay of Clashfern. So I used to assist in drafting very crude basic drafts as a trainee of the Lord Advocate's speeches and following them around basically and observing them, and thereafter a whole series of other Lord Advocates. And in a sense, I was almost like an apprentice for a job I was never going to get. And I had a lengthy time out when I was a fiscal in Airdrie and then in Glasgow, in the Sheriff Court in Glasgow as well. But I came back to Crown Office as Head of Policy. So again, worked with the law officers. So in a sense, I probably knew more about the role of the Lord Advocate and the Solicitor General than many others had, simply by observing all these different Lord Advocates and Solicitor Generals and how they interacted with their counterparts in Westminster. And they're all very different. But the one thing I think is striking is that while there was a political dimension insofar as they were appointed by particular political parties and may have been members of those, when it came to the role of Lord Advocate, they were all absolutely jealous of the independence of the Lord Advocate. And that was marked with them all. And I found all of them to be people of really good public interest lawyers. That's what they were. And so it was a huge privilege. And they were, as I say, it was like, it was like all sorts. It was, they came from very different backgrounds and were very different characters as well. So that struck me, and again, as a civil servant working on the creation of the Scotland Act, because I worked as Head of Policy along with the other civil servants in drafting and assisting to draft the Act and the debates about how things should be. But my job essentially for the Crown Office and Fiscal Service was to protect the independence of the law officers from any political interference in this process. It could happen inadvertently or indeed intentionally for that matter in that process.
Given you brought that up, sorry to interrupt, and I know other colleagues will want to ask you about this. You have mentioned about the independence of the office of the Lord Advocate. And of course, we're now into live debate just about the role of the Lord Advocate as head of the prosecution service, member of government. And
yes.
I don't think I've seen anything on record about your views about this. But what do you make of this current debate? I know that there's a live bill in Westminster, and it's certainly something that colleagues in the Scottish Parliament are keen to look at.
I think it's important you constantly look and scrutinise all of these posts to make sure that they're still relevant, that there isn't anything that can be done to improve them. But fundamentally, so much comes down to the integrity of the individuals who hold these posts. And I think that's something which I am enormously proud to have observed, is that I didn't observe anything by way of political influence in the decisions which were made by my predecessors. And given that I was not a member of any political party, and nobody knows what my politics are, therefore that decision to have someone who was non-political in itself was reinforcement of what the role was about. And it was just that I happened to be qualified because as I say, I'd been doing an apprenticeship for it for many years, that the outside world wasn't aware of, but the Lord Advocates were.
And just lastly from me, you did touch on this briefly about your relationships with other law officers across the UK and UK government senior civil service, and you didn't mention other devolved nations. Could you maybe just talk just a little bit about that type of engagement with UK law officers, particularly in the earlier days when you were perhaps not in position in the office of Lord Advocate, but just did that work well? Was that access available to you? Was that advice offered, in what was relatively a new role?
Well, we had regular meetings with the UK law officers, the Advocate General and the Attorney, and we also had bilateral visits with the Northern Irish law officers and with the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney in Dublin as well as European senior prosecutors who would come together. I got invited to address all of France's prosecutors in very poor French. So there was a coming together conferences where people would discuss what's happening, in various areas, terrorism or whatever other areas we would come together. And therefore you got to know people. And the relationship was excellent. And indeed, and Jim Wallace remains a good friend now after many years of, the relationship was excellent. And it had to work, because if it wasn't made to work, the whole thing would have disintegrated. You had to listen and you had to be reasonable and you had to be able to negotiate in a way which wouldn't compromise a proper interpretation of what the provisions of the Act were. And therefore, my own experience of it was a very positive one. It was a huge privilege to do that role.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll hand over to Michael Shanks. Michael.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Lady Elish. I feel fairly certain your definition of very poor French is not the same as my definition of very poor French. But I just want to pick up on a few things from the questions from the chair around. Is there not a danger that the fact that the Lord Advocate is both the head of prosecution and an advisor, the principal legal advisor to the government, and sits around the cabinet table, whether physically or invited or not, is that not a conflict of interest, or at least is there not a perception of a conflict of interest?
I think you could see that in those circumstances. And again, much would depend on as with many things, it depends on the integrity, but the checks and balances are there too in terms of the minutes. If you were to misbehave at one point, you're going to be found out later. Eventually, all these records and minutes of meetings are published. You may be a bit older, but nonetheless, it come back to haunt you if you're not carrying out your role correctly. I didn't attend cabinet meetings when I was Lord Advocate. I would look at the minutes, and if there was something I could see in the minutes of the cabinet meeting that gave me concern that there might be an issue of law that might crystallise, then I would attend cabinet. And it was always quite clear that if I wanted to attend cabinet, that I had that right of audience to be able to advise the government that they were going off-piste in terms of their competence. But it very rarely got to that because, of course, we were quite fastidious in looking at what was being considered at cabinet. But I attended cabinet in the early days with the Labour Liberal coalition. But Alex Salmond was I think he was more concerned that the Lord Advocate was not, as he saw it, contaminated with politics or whatever. It's so important that he had kept me on as Lord Advocate after I had, as you would do, when the Labour coalition lost the election, then that you normally go with the government. So I had packed my bags ready to go, and I got a phone call from Alex Salmond, and he asked how I was. I said, fine. I said, ready to go, wish you very best wishes. He said, well, I'd like you to unpack your bags and come round and see me because I'd like to discuss you staying on as Lord Advocate, which was astonishing. But I think it was evidence of the integrity that's attributed to the role. And I think that that's not something that was peculiar to me. It was something which I think was generally the position with my predecessors.
And in more recent years, we've seen legislation ending up in the Supreme Court for the first time, and then actually quite a number of cases now that have ended up there. And one view, I suppose, of that is that has been a failure of policy making at a certain level, but also potentially these intergovernmental relationships that might have foresaw any particular challenges and maybe tried to change the legislation before it got to that way, or to bring the people round the table to try and make it work. What's your view on the fact that policies are ending up in the Supreme Court when they didn't for the first 20 years of devolution?
Well, I was in the Supreme Court and indeed the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council before that, but some of that wasn't as much about the constitutional issues. It was because for the first time this court had jurisdiction over criminal matters by dint of whether or not they were compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights and various other aspects. So I would be there as Lord Advocate arguing in that court as well. But the issue about the competence of the devolved government to legislate on a matter, I think has been up there. But that's what that court's there for. I don't think it should be seen as a failure. It obviously can try, but sometimes matters are obscure. An example, for instance, was you remember the case of plural plaques, and we wish to put a bill through in Scotland to compensate people who had acquired plural plaques in their lungs from working with asbestos, and there was medical evidence to suggest that it wasn't particularly harmful. It was just benign, but it was something that was present. So the UK government took a different view. The Scottish government took a view that people should still be compensated because of the fear and the damage that had been done to their bodies. And the UK government, the Advocate General, took a different view from me and considered that it should not be within the competence of the Scottish Government. So we went to the court and it was determined that it was within the competence of the Scottish Government. So these debates are there not necessarily as a failure. It's a good thing. It teases out issues. It allows us to develop more law, and it may be seen as an unnecessary expense for some people. Sometimes you have to, if there is in something that appears to be plain in a statute or in a provision, it can turn out to be quite ambiguous when it comes to a practical situation, and that's when sometimes we have to go to court to get the judges to give their wisdom to the matter.
Just on another issue around compensation, because you mentioned one case there, one of the scandals that your successors are dealing with is, of course, the Post Office Horizon prosecutions, which were undertaken by the Crown Office. And towards the end of your time in office, there were stories circulating then that the evidence that was being used was questionable at best. Were you aware at all, when you were Lord Advocate, of any questions being raised about the evidence given in the prosecutions in Scotland?
No, not at all. I can't even remember if any of these cases surfaced at all. I mean, the types of cases they were would be dealt with in local offices, local procurators fiscal, and if they came into Crown Office for any reason, they would be dealt with by Crown Counsel. Rather than the Lord Advocate was there to deal with, if there was someone was offering a plea of guilty to culpable homicide in a murder case, etc., or if there was a major, high court cases or cases. So they wouldn't see that, have no recollection whatsoever of any of those. That's not to say with the memories fade whether or not in the passage I did see something at that time, but I had no recollection of these cases at all.
So maybe just lastly then, in terms of a remedy to that, there's been some debate here over the past few weeks about whether it should be for the Scottish Parliament with its judicial functions to pass a bill to exonerate those that were wrongly convicted. And there's been argument here that it should be for the UK Parliament because the Post Office is a UK-wide body. Do you have any advice for your successors on what should happen next in Scotland in terms of these convictions?
I think it would be extraordinarily daft of me to give an opinion on the basis of a question asked. You'll be pleased to know that we give an awful lot more care and attention to that. You'd want to research it and you want to look at precisely what the terms of the statute are, etc. Very very dull stuff, but I'm sure it'd be great if I was tempted to say what I had a view on, but I wouldn't do that. And now you probably couldn't afford me.
Well, you can't blame me for trying to tempt you at least. Thank you, Lady Elish.
It was a very good try, and I'm pretty certain we couldn't afford you, but we'll leave it at that. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Chair, and lovely to have you here, Lady Elish. I just wanted to pick up the unique part of your role where obviously you did transition from one Scottish Government to another. You described your elevation to the role of Lord Advocate as unexpected, despite the fact that clearly you had an excellent pedigree. Why did you feel it was unexpected? Because you had no political affiliation, or was there something else?
Well, I didn't have any political affiliation, and I was a civil servant, and I had flirted with going to the bar at that stage, and it might have been something I was going to do at a later stage. But I had two young children, and I loved the role of Procurator Fiscal. I mean, it's one of the least understood but really important offices that is unique to Scotland. It combines, the investigative role with the investigating public disasters. It is hugely interesting, and therefore, I loved every role I had in that. So there was nothing really tempting me, and this invitation came out of the blue. And when I was invited to become Solicitor General, I didn't accept it at first because I was just so taken aback. And I come from a background of financial sort of insecurity. My father's local coal man in government, and after the Clean Air Act, times were very hard financially. So, of course, being a civil servant was safe in some ways, and I wasn't that adventurous about finance. But when I was asked, I had so many phone calls. I was almost bludgeoned by a number of QCs and friends who said that I would be absolutely silly not to take this opportunity, and I loved it. It was an amazing, very hard job, very tough job in the open, but nonetheless a huge privilege.
Well, in terms of the role of Procurator Fiscal, we hear plenty of stories from our colleague Alistair Carmichael on that. So, and as a former police officer, I appreciate the variety as well. Do you think that that position where you had no political affiliation made it easier for you to transition between the governments when the SNP minority administration came in 2007?
Well, I think clearly they must have thought that I was doing something all right, or I don't think Alex Salmond would have invited me to come on, but I don't think that was a quality that was unique to me. I think it's because I wasn't a member of any political party and had no allegiance that it made it easier. Yes. But my predecessors, and I watched them from Lord McConnell to the Lord Boyd, and they were just, well, they were all men. I was going to say they were good men, but they were all really good men. Yes. And I watched them making decisions. I watched them making really tough and difficult decisions when I was a young young solicitor. And it was a heavy, if you think about Lockerbie, if you think about all of these other big disasters that happened in Dunblane at the school, these are things which Lord Advocates they don't just go home and leave it at the office, so they're all very, very good people. And that made me also, think twice about taking the post, because I didn't accept it immediately. And as I say, I had to be cajoled by a few people over the next few days. But I'm very, very glad I did do it. And it's a huge privilege to serve in that office.
Thank you. And in terms of the one change you mentioned was in relation to your attendance at Cabinet, that you were less likely to attend after 2007. What else was different in terms of the change in government party about your role?
Well, it was. I think Alex Salmond just did not want there to be even a possibility. So if there was a specific issue they wanted my advice on, or I felt there was something untoward and perhaps relevant, then I could attend.
You weren't prevented, it was just a different approach.
There's no question of me being excluded. It was basically that I had, and that worked well. It could have been awkward if something came up and I wasn't in the town. I was always, if it was on, I was there. So I was just round the corner, I could come down. But so in terms of the difference, no difference at all. I think that Alex Salmond treated Frank Mulholland, it was, who's Solicitor General, and myself, again, with complete respect. And the only sort of social interaction we had, it was quite arm's length. Again, Nicola Sturgeon the same. And a sort of respectful relationship, but it was a distant one, you know. So we weren't the only time we went out for one meal with Alex Salmond, and I think it was maybe it was 2 meals with Alex Salmond, but they started at 9 o'clock at night. And I've got no stamina, but they could go on to about midnight,
Yes.
and that's all I can remember was that, oh, you know, oh God, you know, I'm going to fall asleep. I've got these 2 kids back at home. I've got to get up the road. But they are, but again, so the relationship was just very much at distance relationship.
Thank you. Can I ask one final question? Given that this is intergovernmental relations that we're discussing, and given that your term covered not only a change in the Scottish Government, but also a change in the UK Government, what observations, if any, do you have in how the intergovernmental relationships changed?
Again, we would get the instances where we would be together would be at conferences, justice conferences that were taking place, but we would have a meeting every so often if there was a problem with a case cross-border. The one where we had to really work very closely with, and that was Ken MacDonald was the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, and we and the law officers was the attack on Glasgow Airport,
yes.
The terrorist attack on Glasgow Airport. And at that point, we had to enter discussions with the English prosecutors regarding who would take jurisdiction to prosecute the case. On that it started in England, and had ended up in Scotland, but had been conceived of in Scotland. The conspiracy had started in Scotland, and therefore we had a debate. So on the Saturday afternoon, I had gone to the emergency office, the emergency meeting of the government, and these negotiations were taking place not about that matter, because then on the Sunday morning, I had a meeting with the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General and the senior police officers from both jurisdictions, and we had a decision then what was the best way. Would look at where did we both have jurisdictions? We did under the Explosive Substances Act, but we didn't know that until the Sunday morning that we could both take it, and because it wasn't clear it was a continuing crime, it wasn't as if it was happening all at once. It was
law rather than relations, very much. Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lady Elish.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Lady Elish, for coming along. I would keep you just very briefly want to go back to something that Michael Shank said when we talked about the different number of times that disputes have ended up in court. And you've been very clear about the fact that the law officers' integrity is important and those remain separate. So do you think the fact that now more disputes between the UK government and the Scottish government are ending up in court is much more to do with the political attitude of the time than the legal advice or anything else, or the position of the Lord Advocate or the Solicitor General? It's all to do with the relationship between the individuals in Whitehall and in Holyrood.
Well, I have to say I don't follow it that closely to know what the relationships are. But the whole structure of the Scotland Act would have failed catastrophically if it was based on personality. Mm-hmm. And that's why all the checks and balances are in there, about competence, about routes of resolving the issues. And I think that the fact that these cases are going to court is not a failure. I think it's quite proper sometimes because it's not clear what the interpretation of a particular action is, or something comes up, a subject comes up, which wasn't something that was conceived of before. And the Scotland Act doesn't clearly set out whether or not this would be devolved or reserved. And therefore, that's when at that point, if it can't be agreed, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's an ill will meeting, you just can't come to an agreement about it, then it's for the court to determine, and if necessary, if the Parliament doesn't like it, for the relevant Parliament to amend it to make it absolutely beyond doubt what the meaning of that provision is, and that it's within the competence of that particular government. So again, I think perhaps politicians like to characterise it, as sort of failures, but I think that's the law officers doing their job.
So would I be fair in characterising that as you are confident, and that we should be confident that the relationship between governments is working and working well, and we shouldn't read anything at all really into recent cases like GRR, etc., ending up in the courts, that is simply the way it's meant to work.
Well, it's one of the mechanisms that's actually built into the Scotland Act, because the reason that new situations would come up which weren't conceived of then. I'm just trying to think about, there's something that's about sex change, and for instance, these sorts of subjects which weren't really prescribed or dealt with at that point. So where does that lie? You know, in what field is that, and in making it absolutely, and should there be a specific provision for that? Because the mechanism in the Act was that it's that which is not reserved was devolved. So the specific issues were reserved, like firearms and various, I think firearms, can't remember what other matters, defence. But so something which is, it's not absolutely clear. But I do think that the relationship between the law officers is very important, that's kept, that they're talking, they're meeting it. And Dorothy Bain, the current Lord Advocate, was an advocate depute when I was the Lord Advocate. And I certainly think that she would understand very much the importance of having good relations with the English and Welsh law officers and the Northern Irish law officers too.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and we have finished dead on 4 o'clock for you, Lady Elish. So we're very, very grateful for your time and taking our questions this afternoon. If there's anything else that you feel you could usefully contribute to this inquiry, please, anything would be gratefully received by this committee. But for this afternoon, thank you very much. And can we now have Lord Jack McConnell, please, to join us?
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and we're absolutely delighted to be joined by former First Minister Lord McConnell, who I will now allow to introduce himself in anything by way of a short introductory statement. Lord McConnell.
Thank you very much. This feels like the apprentice or mastermind or something. Suddenly you find yourself in the seat. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to attend the committee and speak on this subject. Thank you also to the committee for having the inquiry, because I think to keep these matters under review on a regular basis is very important, and I'm sure this inquiry will build on the previous discussions that have taken place on this topic inside government and inside Parliament. I would just make a couple of introductory remarks. First of all, that I think it is a remarkable achievement of those who designed the original Scotland Act, that despite all of the political ups and downs, of which there have been many in the last 25 years, the core principles of the Act, the original Act, and the way in which the governments, the civil servants, and the two parliaments are meant to both work together but work alone, has stood the test of time, and I think that is not necessarily the case elsewhere in the world, and I think it's a testament to the original design. That's not to say that there are not some significant issues and problems. I do think, though, that we are now in a time when politics is much more divided and divisive, where public service is perhaps less valued or practiced, in terms of the basic principles of public service and public service leadership. And I think also the powers have become a little bit more complicated and less transparent than they were back in 98, 99. And therefore that makes intergovernmental relations more difficult than they were back then. And on that topic in particular, 3 very brief comments. First of all, I think the formal structures have never worked. I think they have been ripe for fundamental change since quite early on, and I think successive governments on both sides, have not really tackled that need for change. So the GMC structure and everything else that's part of the formalities, I think, has been something that has been a part of the devolution settlement that's not really operated well in practice. I think, secondly, political relationships are absolutely vital. And to me, it was quite clear very early on that people knew each other. It wasn't just the former Westminster politicians that I think were previously asked about knowing each other and knowing systems. But even those of us who were younger and had never served at Westminster knew our colleagues south of the border, knew people across different political parties. And I think that has changed over the 25 years and was always going to change. And I think the parties have not built in mechanisms to try and counter that. And then thirdly, I think there is a significant issue about civil service experience, knowledge, capacity that needs structures to be put in place in order to try and counter the lack of experience and knowledge at both ends of the M1.
And of course, you and I go all the way back to the US, Scotland, in the early 1980s, which we were both servants of the executive at that point. And I'm just wondering, on that basis, like you've been in Scottish politics a long time, as long, unfortunately, as long as I have, and you've seen lots of things, and Scotland's made huge progress with the coming of a Parliament. 25 years we're now celebrating this week. Lots of comment being made about the Scottish Parliament. What do you make of the journey that we've been on? What when you see where you and I started with all these years ago back in the 1980s and where we are just now, how would you sum up the progress and journey Scotland's made since then?
Wow, that's a big question for us to try and put into a short answer. I mean, you know, I saw decade after decade in my life the development of the campaign and then the implementation of the will of the people and then the practice of governing. You know, I saw the excitement of the 1970s dashed at the end of the 1970s, the relative indifference of the 1980s, and a few of us struggled on to keep the flame alive, but then at the end of the 1980s, parties started to come together and realise you had to do this as a nation and not as a party. And then the 1990s, both building the support for the principle of devolved home rule for Scotland, but also sorting out the details of how it would work in practice so that it wouldn't fail in a legislative sense or in a referendum. And then we've seen over 2 decades of that in practice. And my view is, this will not necessarily meet with approval right across the political spectrum, but I do think it was not a surprise that the first 2 or 3 years were very rocky. It wasn't just about the First Minister dying, but it was about the fact that it was a new institution, lots of scrutiny, transparency that hadn't been there for Scottish politicians at Westminster before, and some real difficulties. I think the Parliament then had about a decade of really productive government, really productive work, both in improving Scotland on a day-to-day basis, but also legislating in areas that had been outstanding for a very long time. The laws that we passed in the first decade or so of the Scottish Parliament, in my time, for example, the land reform laws, the criminal justice reforms that Elish and Colin Boyd were part of, along with Cathy Jameson, between 2003 and 2007, the new rights for children with special needs, for vulnerable adults, and so on. All of these pieces of legislation would have struggled to find time at Westminster in that decade. And the fundamental changes that came into place were a result of Scotland having a parliament it could use. I do think in the 10 to 15 years since, the Parliament's lost its way, and I think there's a real challenge now after 25 years to improve the quality of what goes on in the Parliament, the level of scrutiny, and I think the intergovernmental relations as well.
You were, of course, First Minister between 2001 and 2007, and I think there's been sort of 3 distinct periods it's been explained to us, and you obviously represent the end of the first period, which was where we had a Labour government across all the nations of the United Kingdom, and relationships were much more on a sort of casual ad hoc basis. Then we went into the 2007 up to the independence referendum, which, you know, surprisingly has been described to us as being reasonably effective, and our respect was a theme that we keep on hearing about that period. And of course after that, leading into the Brexit, and to, as most people have described as being a much more fractious period. Were you sort of conscious that, well, obviously you weren't because you were looking to be First Minister after 2007, that that was a golden period in terms of intergovernment relations and there was much more of a casual relationship? How would you characterise your relationship with UK government ministers, and how did you get access? How was business effectively done when you were First Minister?
Well, I think that was... I think the characterisation of that period as having beneficial intergovernmental relations comes down, I think, to the sense of purpose in both governments. Whatever people might think of individual decisions made or the overall culture or direction of the new Labour government, whatever people might think of the coalition after 2010 up to 2015, I think that period of government had a sense of purpose on trying to impact on people's daily lives and improve our country that has not been exhibited since 2015-2016. Similarly, I think in Scotland, we certainly had an absolute focus on delivering the benefits, the potential of a Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government that we had all dreamed about for so long, and making sure that those early years were very, very productive. And I think that my immediate successors, whereas I might have disagreed with some of the decisions they made, I think they had a strategy for having a Scottish Government that was seen to be managed and delivered good changes for Scotland as a means through which they could build the campaign for independence. So I think that you had two governments of various political colours at different times that might not have always got on smoothly, but they were focused on what the impact of their legislation and their decisions were. And I'm not absolutely certain that's been the case in either government since 2015-2016.
It's quite surprising, the list of achievements that you gave us in the 10 years, the first 10 years of Parliament. You didn't mention the smoking ban, which is one of your...
The thing about the smoking ban is that is the moment when the Parliament came of age. The ban on smoking in public places in decades gone by would have been an experiment in Scotland that would have been resisted by the people.
Just wondering on that, this is given you've talked about current arrangements and relationships, if we tried to get the smoking ban through the Scottish Parliament now, do you think it would be successful, given where the UK government's attitude and response to things being designed in Scotland?
Well, we were very clear that it was legal and for us to take that legislation through, and that was one of my very first questions was, is this something that we can do legally? And our law officers and the legal advisors in the Parliament were clear that it could happen. But the reason it happened, and the reason it happened successfully, was because it was Scotland making a decision for itself. And if that had been a decision that had been imposed, it would have been resisted. I think it was the first example of the people of Scotland accepting a decision, because the public opinion was split about 50-50.
I remember it very clearly.
The people in Scotland accepting a decision that they did not want, because that decision had been made by their elected Parliament rather than by a Parliament of the whole UK. And I think that was a very seminal moment in the development of the Parliament.
Another policy or piece of legislation was the fresh talent. There is no way on earth that the Scottish Government would get anything like the fresh talent through agreed by the Westminster Parliament anymore. I mean, did you secure any resistance from Westminster as you were trying to put that through, or were you sort of left to get on with it just to see how it worked?
The fresh talent scheme, I think again is really interesting, partly because of what was said about it as well. Its impact was phenomenal, and I mean it really did change. It changed the whole attitude to Scottish population growth. That was part of the reason for doing it. It wasn't just the practical impact of people staying who had a contribution to make, or people coming who had a contribution to make. It was also sending out a signal about the kind of Scotland that we wanted. When David Blunkett, as Home Secretary, agreed with the proposal, I think he did that because he could see that we were serious about it. We weren't creating a symbolic gesture or doing something we hadn't thought through. We'd done a lot of work on it. We'd worked it up with his officials so he had a choice, and he then agreed that he overruled other people who were not very keen in order to agree it. And then when he came to Scotland and he said the one-size-fits-all Home Office is a thing of the past. Can you imagine anybody saying that today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, very interesting. And thank you for that. It's Christine Jordan.
Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us, Lord McConnell. I'd like to investigate a wee bit more, or go into a wee bit more what you were just saying about that seminal moment when the smoking ban was accepted by people. And the chair suggested that that couldn't happen nowadays. Do you think that's a fair assessment? Do you think it could happen nowadays if it was a law that the people in Scotland actually wanted? That there was this feeling that it was progress? Do you think it could happen?
I don't think there's any evidence, pretty much for about a decade now, of those who have responsibility in the Scottish Government choosing creative solutions like that within the existing settlement. I think they would prefer. There has been a consistent approach now for too long of wanting to have a debate and an argument and a challenge on who has the power, rather than on how is the power used. And I think the same thing at the other end of the M1. I think you have governments that have been clearly they've been chaotic, they have been difficult to work with, but I think not really focused on the impact of the policy. So, for example, if you take that immigration example, it's quite clear that there are different issues of workforce capacity, skills, even housing capacity, all these other issues, educational capacity around the country in different regions. And a creative approach to UK immigration policy is perfectly possible if you have a Home Secretary who thinks on the job and isn't just interested in slogans. So I think to use that as a very good example, I think ministers in Scotland have slipped into a default position, which is to argue about the power rather than argue to get the power used better, which is what we did on Fresh Talent. Nothing was ever devolved in Fresh Talent. It was simply that the Home Office had a separate scheme for Scotland that they then worked in conjunction with our existing powers. And then at the other end, I think in the UK government, there's been a lack of willingness a lack of caring about delivery, really, but also a lack of willingness to be flexible and to work creatively with the devolved governments in different areas of policy.
Does that go back to, you were saying that you felt a sense of purpose had been lost, that there was a great sense of purpose, but since about 2015, I think you said, you felt that that's been lost, and for the past decade, there's been no real sense of purpose in the Scottish Government. Do you think that's been replaced by this determination that you mentioned, this, being concerned with arguing and challenging, rather than the sense of purpose being just to do the best thing for the people of Scotland?
I think, with due respect to 4 excellent members of Parliament who are in front of me here, who I have great admiration for, I think there's a serious problem, I think, in both parliaments and at ministerial level as well, where too many people are there to sell a line, to promote a position that they're asked to promote by their party or their leadership. People are promoted on the basis of their ability to sell that line rather than actually get things done, manage a department and drive change. I think that's an unfortunate aspect of modern democracy in the UK, and it's a problem in Edinburgh, it's a problem in London, and that's why I think structures need to be put in place. When I just to roll back to what I said at the beginning, I think in such a divided and sometimes quite lightweight political environment, I think you need a proper disputes mechanism to resolve some of these issues. And I think the GMC type structure, whatever it's called, should be there to resolve, deliberate transparently on disputes rather than as some cosy meeting place where people get together and have a chat. And I think civil servants, I think there should be a rule on civil servants that they should have to serve. If you're going to go to a senior level in the Scottish or the UK civil service, I think you should have to, if you're in the UK civil service, I think it should be compulsory. You've done at least 2 years in a devolved government at some point in your early career. And I think similarly in the Scottish Government, you should not be promoted above a certain level if you haven't spent some time in the Cabinet Office or the Treasury or sort of the Foreign Office or somewhere in London. And I think I think you need to build these structures in. The middle bit on political personalities, you can't really change. You just have to, parties have to work at that, I think, work at it much harder. Maybe certain things you can do, but it's not for legislation or government structures to fix that problem. But I think on the first problem, in terms of how do you resolve these disputes transparently and effectively, I think the intergovernmental relationship structure needs to be changed. And I think in terms of the work that's done behind the scenes, back channels, understanding, knowledge, people being able to talk to each other. So it's not just the lawyers like Elish that can talk to each other, but it's all the other civil servants and public figures as well. I think having some kind of rules in place that make sure that people have the knowledge and the contacts that you get by sharing an office with somebody, I think that would make a big, big difference.
It would be fair to characterise that as a mechanism which doesn't just lay down rules, but introduces people to one another and an understanding and an experience of both parliaments, and the Welsh Parliament, the Northern Irish Assembly as well. They have an experience of all those administrations so that they come at it from a common purpose or a common understanding rather than purpose.
Absolutely. And there'll be times when there are disagreements, and there'll be times when people have different opinions to share and different advice for ministers, and that's fine. But I think the lack of, I think it really is quite a big issue that there's a lack of knowledge, experience, informal contact. All of the key civil servants that I worked with, even the younger ones who were new and excited about devolution, really enthusiastic about how we could stretch what we were doing, push it to the limits. All of them, had really good contacts in the Cabinet Office or the Treasury or somewhere in London where they had spent some time over previous years. And they benefited from that. And I think their colleagues in London benefited from it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Shanks.
Thank you, and good to see you, Lord McConnell. Thanks for your time today. Just got a couple of questions which you've actually touched on already, but particularly around your background being the first Minister that hadn't served here and hadn't been a Minister in the Scotland office. And do you think there were any difficulties there because you didn't have those pre-existing relationships? I mean, you've already said you did in terms of the party, but do you think you faced challenges that maybe Donald and Henry hadn't?
That is an interesting question. First Minister who hadn't served at Westminster in any of the three devolved nations. So all of my counterparts were former MPs in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So that was a factor. I think it had benefits. It maybe gave me a freedom and a freshness that was needed at that particular time. But it also had drawbacks in not having been part of the club, despite how good my relationships were with certain individuals. So yes, I think it had positives and negatives, and the best way to carry out the job is to understand those positives and negatives and use others to help you with the negatives, basically. And that's partly where I use the civil service, because I think I had some top quality civil servants who had good relationships with their colleagues in London, and they could follow some of those back channels in a way that those avenues were not always open to me at the time.
I was reading you gave I think an interview a couple of years ago for the Institute for Government about quite a lot of these things, and it struck me one of the things that came through several times was you said that you found it quite easy to pick up the phone to a minister in different departments and talk about Scotland. You didn't feel that you had to go through the Scotland office, or you didn't feel that you had to go through a formal. You could pick up the phone to the Foreign Office or the Home Office or whatever. Clearly that doesn't happen now, and partly that's because of relationships that have broken down. But do you think that can come back in some way, or do you think you were just at a point in the devolution journey where you still knew who these people were, and picking up the phone wasn't quite such a big thing to do?
It was partly that I knew some people. I mean, I had a very good relationship with the Prime Minister before he was Prime Minister. Obviously, there were quite a lot of Scots in that administration, some of whom I had better relationships with than others. But there were others as well that I had known for a long time. David Blunkett had been a council leader at roughly the same time as I was a council leader. We'd come up through local government into national politics together. So there were people that I knew and had good relationships with, and others who were completely new. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example. Alan Milburn, for example, who was the Cabinet Office Minister at one point, and we had quite a working relationship with. I didn't know him at all, really, before he became a cabinet minister. So there were people at that time, who were close and who weren't. I think it was. I do want to say something very clear here. I think it was absolutely critical that not only the First Minister but other ministers in the Scottish Government could have direct relationships with the right departments in the UK Government. Yeah. I'm not a fan of the position of Secretary of State for Scotland. I think it's a pre-devolution position that should be abolished. Anyway, but even if it's there, it should be there to help and not hinder. And one of the reasons I didn't like the GMC structure was it was focused too much on the Prime Minister and the First Minister, and that I wanted to see strong relationships develop between my Environment and Rural Affairs Minister Ross Finney and David Miliband, who I think was the DEFRA Secretary for at least a part of the time that I was First Minister. I wanted really good relationships between Cathy Jameson and the Home Secretary. I wanted, when she was Justice Minister, I wanted her. It was difficult in health because the systems were so separate from each other, and we did have arguments over smoke and contaminated blood inquiries, all sorts of issues. But again, people should be able to talk to each other. And when they weren't able to talk to each other, that was when things broke down. So I think that's a very important part of the intergovernmental relationship.
I think that's really interesting. But you're the first witness, I think I'm right in saying, that's mentioned that idea that it's not just the First Minister's relationships with the UK government, but the individual ministers. And I think that's a really important thing for our inquiry, actually. Because we've talked a lot about formal structures, and they clearly have a place, but actually that's a more informal but really important structure. I want to take you back to a question.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but can I just say, and these things can happen across different political parties. The fact that Ross Finney was a Liberal Democrat did not stop him having a great relationship with different DEFRA secretaries, even though we were following different policies at times. The fact that we had a Liberal Democrat Transport Minister did not stop Alistair Darling, as Transport Secretary, devolving the railway infrastructure so that we could run the whole system from Scotland. And what was probably a mistake in the original devolution legislation. So encouraging that enhances delivery. It shouldn't create division.
And I think there's a tendency sometimes to think that the only relationships we have are within party, but of course Scotland being Scotland, we actually have relationships right across the political spectrum. So I think that's important to remember. Just going back to fresh talent for a minute, because you made a really interesting observation, I think, to Christine Jardine, that it wasn't about devolving the power, it was about having a difference within the existing powers. There's been a lot of examples recently of what were reserved powers being devolved to Scotland, and instead of trying to find a place within the existing system, we've created Scottish versions at huge cost and at huge time. The one that sticks to me is around disability benefits, where instead of trying to work with the DWP to use existing systems, but in a Scottish context, we set up a whole new IT system and a whole new structure. Do you think there is, maybe it's just a reflection on the fact it's 25 years on, is there now a sense that things should be particular to Scotland and delivered in Scotland and very much with a Scottish badge on it? Has the days of trying to work together on projects but with a Scottish solution to a Scottish problem just gone completely? Or is it just the political situation we find ourselves in just now?
I'm going to try and describe what I think is the SNP's approach to governing in Scotland on that issue, and try and do it as neutrally as I can. But I think there has been a concerted effort since 2007 to build Scottish institutions. I think the centralisation of police in Scotland, for example, and some other services in Scotland to central Scottish-wide agencies instead of being locally controlled, has been part of that lifting power up from the local level to the Scottish level. And I think when powers have been devolved, in the main, new institutions have been created for similar reasons. So I think it's been a deliberate strategy. People will have their own opinions on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't have any knowledge of the more recent ones to know whether they are working well or not working well. So I wouldn't want us to particularly comment on that. What I would say is, if intergovernmental relations are going to work properly, but more importantly, if the different governments are actually going to deliver for people in Scotland well, whether they're getting on well with each other or not, I think you've got to get the three elements right. One is to respect the settlement, where you might have opinions on what each other are doing, and that's perfectly valid at different levels of government, but you should respect the relative autonomy of both Scottish Government and the UK Government to work in the areas that come under their legislative competence, and the same with the two parliaments. The second area is in areas where you can work together without changing the legislative competence. I mean, it's difficult, for example, to deal with the problems of poverty and failures of a welfare system to get people into work and people functioning outside the home and so on, unless you have an effort that crosses health and housing as well as welfare benefits and taxation systems and incentives for work. And I think we didn't get that right. There were 6 or 7 secretaries of state for pensions and welfare when I was first minister, when I was a minister in the 8 years, and every time we were getting to work well with somebody in a joint way on these issues, they would get moved, or there'd be a scandal and they would resign, and somebody else would come in and we'd start all over again. So so that's just not something that worked under the Labour-Liberal coalition any better than it worked under the SNP. But it is an area where I think both governments need to have a bit more humility and be willing to work with each other in the interest of people and finding complex solutions to complex problems. And then the third area is where you can devolve inside the scheme, and that's what we did on Fresh Talent, and we did on a number of other areas. I think the renewables, for example, the kick-off for Scottish renewable expansion, which happened in 2002, just after I became First Minister, was as a result of the renewable obligation certificates getting devolved by DEFRA to our Rural Affairs Department. And we suddenly had the ability to give permissions for onshore wind. And that was when the industry took off in Scotland. And that wasn't a change in the powers, but it was a decision inside the Scotland Act to devolve that responsibility from the UK government to the Scottish government. And we grabbed it with both hands. So I think these three elements are all important. There's the respecting of the different competencies. There's when the two governments can actually work together using their competencies together. And then there's also the flexibility in the Scotland Act. One of the great strengths of the Scotland Act, which is to temporarily or otherwise devolve a particular element of a reserved competence so that a solution can be found in Scotland.
I just ask a very quick final question. You obviously led a coalition government. In the last hour, I think we've got a new First Minister who is going to have to make the parliamentary arithmetic work. Probably not a coalition, but some kind of... and in your interview with the Institute of Government, you reflected quite a lot on how coalition government worked, and particularly because you went into the election in 2003 basically as a coalition government seeking re-election. So do you have any advice for John Swinney on how he might make government work in the next few months, maybe a few years if he's lucky?
I don't have any advice on how he deals with his dilemma, in that there might only be one party in the Parliament that's willing to work with them, and therefore that creates a bit of a relationship outside of a coalition that's going to be a wee bit uneasy. More generally, I think the success. First of all, I wish him well. Secondly, I wish Hamza Yousaf well. Hard hand he was dealt. Decent guy. I've had a good relationship with him as a minister over the years. I hope he's got a future, and I hope, and he's behaved with some dignity over the last 7 days, and we should be grateful for that. Not all his predecessors did that. Moving forward, I think if John Swinney is going to make a success of his time as First Minister, he's going to have to be honest about the problems that Scotland currently faces. We can't spin our way out of the problems we have in our education and health services. We can't create jobs by producing headlines or having fancy slogans. It needs hard work, honesty, and some creative ideas being welcomed at the centre again. And I think if he does that, then I certainly wish him well.
Thank you. Jack.
Can I just ask something briefly? I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't ask this. You talked about, and other people have mentioned it before, there's no place now for a Secretary of State for Scotland in the modern setup. Is there a way that you envisage the department or the Scotland office could work with the Scottish Government and help create a better relationship? You said that the structures never worked from the beginning, at the very beginning when you were speaking. Is that a way that we could make the structures work, if somehow there was a different relationship between the Scotland office and the Scottish Government?
I just think the Scotland office was there for a purpose, pre-devolution. It was a powerful, powerful department, had massive responsibilities. The civil servants in the department had incredible power when the ministers were down in London all week, and they were up in Edinburgh running the education service and the health service and everything else. The ministers themselves covered a wide range of departmental responsibilities that probably stretched them to the limit, made it very difficult to really drive change unless a minister was a really exceptional individual, and that happened on both sides of the political spectrum over the years. I just think 25 years on, there is a real need to look at that structure. We almost changed it. Tony Blair tried to change it in 2003 after the election, in a reshuffle that summer. And it hadn't been, the reshuffle had not been properly planned, and the implications had not been thought through, because there are lots of legal responsibilities of the Secretaries of State. So if you're going to change the position, then you have to prepare it properly, and you have to find a way of describing in legislation who's going to carry out those responsibilities. But I think if you change the structure to have a powerful role, but potentially Deputy Prime Minister, certainly an equivalent to the power and reach of the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary and the Chancellor, one of the great offices of state that was responsible for the nations and regions of the UK, then that would give the devolved nations a more powerful voice at the centre in that direction, but it would also mean that the centre of government was more focused on the need to build those relationships and deliver across the whole UK. And I would then have a powerful Minister of State role for each of the three devolved nations within that structure. And I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work. And I think it would enhance the relationship, and it would ultimately deliver better for people. But I think we're a long way off that.
And that's exactly what this committee recommended in its last look at intergovernmental relations. I'm just interested when you said that you were, I never thought about this, that you were the first Minister that hadn't served at Westminster. And I think there's only yourself, Nicola Sturgeon and Hamza Yousaf now who, and amongst the pantheon of First Ministers that haven't been down here. And it's just a relationship type issue, because, like we've heard that this period was characterised by ad hoc arrangements, meetings, phone calls, But I sort of remember, and I want just interest you use a sort of tempted Henry McLeish to sort of give an answer to this, that there was a little bit of an attitude amongst Westminster Labour MPs that you weren't to get too far ahead of yourselves. And this, I think this particularly happens round about the smoking ban and fresh talent. It's who do they think they are? And, you know, like the suggestion that you call yourself a Scottish government and the advent of the White-Headed Club in the Scottish Parliament as a result of that. Did you actually feel that there was a sense from Labour MPs down here that, you know, we'll let you get on with that, but don't push it too far? And then, of course, Joanne Lamont's famous contribution to this, when she characterised it again as a branch office. Did you ever sort of feel that was what it was like for you when you were First Minister?
There were different personalities. And some were enthusiastic and some were not. One of the things that was interesting to me was that the relatively small number of my colleagues who had been publicly either cautious or hostile to devolution were among the best at respecting the new settlement. So Tam Dael, for example, who I'd spent 20 years debating with on devolution. He was much, much older than me, but we were, you know, we knew each other. We were adversaries in the debate over the 80s and the 90s. I think Tam was the only Labour MP not to sign the Scottish Constitutional Convention Charter when we finalised that in 1995. The week I became First Minister, got in touch with me and told me how much he would give me support, unquestioning support, because he wanted the person who was the First Minister of Scotland to succeed, regardless of what he thought about the institution.
There's always a handwritten letter from Tam, so please remember.
So I think, you know, it was interesting. Different people took different approaches. I think there was a general psychological challenge, if I can put it like that, to those who had had wide-ranging responsibilities and local stakeholder engagement in their constituencies as members of Parliament prior to 99, who suddenly found that their jobs were very, very different.
I think that held back the early development of the Scottish Parliament and Scottish democracy. There were MPs down here possessively holding on to what they felt was their authority and their power arrangements.
Not really. There were some Scottish MPs who were unhappy with the smoking ban. They didn't stop it happening. There were some Scottish MPs that questioned what we were doing on fresh talent and some of the other things that we did in areas where we were working with the Home Office or Home Secretaries. They didn't stop us doing it. So I don't think it held us back. I think it was maybe it was an unexpected tension, but it was one that, with hindsight, we should have anticipated. I think when people's jobs change to that extent, it's perhaps natural that they will feel a little bit of they'll feel a little bit uneasy. And I think what was true is that when new generations came in initially, then they were much more accepting of the situation and were willing to pick up their responsibilities and work with them. What's sad, I think, is that over time, the new generations of politicians have not had that sort of personal contact and experience that I talked about earlier, that allows them to really truly understand what's happening elsewhere. Whereas people like, I mentioned David Blunkett earlier, Charles Clarke would be another example. There were a number of senior, Mo Molan would be another example, a number of senior secretaries of state in the Blair government who were representing English constituencies, were very identifiable as English politicians. But they really got devolution because they'd followed the debate over the past 20 years closely. They knew a lot of us, and we were able to work very closely with them. And I think that is something that will have changed, I think, probably quite dramatically over the years. I don't think very many of the current members of the Cabinet will really understand what's happened in Scotland since I was a boy.
Indeed. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Chair, and nice to see you, Lord McConnell. I just want to pick up on the latter points that Christine Jardine was asking about in terms of the role of the Scotland office. I think our colleague Alistair Carmichael feels similar. But I suppose my question is what you outlined in terms of a Deputy Prime Minister, I think does give value in terms of sending that message, though we've had a previous Prime Minister in recent years who called himself the Minister for the Union as well, and that maybe didn't go so well. But the thing that I thought was very interesting and I thought was also of value was what you described in relation to those direct engagements with government departments. Is there a risk that any type of structure that gives a sort of nation's role actually then potentially weakens the opportunities to build those relationships on a departmental level?
Well, I've not been a 100% advocate over the last 25 years for putting a really firm structure into this. I think there's a need for a dispute structure, yes. But creating an absolutely firm structure, I think, goes against the grain of the British political system, yes, and our sort of constitutional setup. And I think we should hesitate to go down that road. There are many faults with the way that the UK and its constituent nations are governed. But we also have many benefits that other countries don't have, and a bit of flexibility is not necessarily a bad thing. But being able to be responsive, creative in the way that we do things can in the right hands, can be really positive. So I am quite keen on a relatively flexible approach, because there will be different personalities, different big issues of the day at different times. But I do think attitudes need to change for that to work. And I think a very good example of that is in the whole area of economic policy. Not only have we had a parliament in Scotland with limited tax raising powers since 1999, but we've had a parliament in Scotland with quite significant tax varying powers since 2015. And yet this country is still delivering budgets and budget decision making and finance acts based on a system from the 1950s or something like that. I mean, it's not even just the 1990s. And we still have this system where the Chancellor stands up on the day and surprises everybody with their announcements on tax. And yet a large part of the tax take is being decided by other people elsewhere in the country. Yes. And there's no prior discussion, there's no attempt to get a synergy or even to kind of expose differences or talk about the impact. And the same thing is now happening in Scotland, where you have a finance minister standing up and announcing tax changes. And it just seems to me that the attitude needs to change. And I think for attitudes like that to change, they probably have to change at the centre. And I think the budget would be a good place to start, because it would be a very strong signal, a more open, transparent approach to building a budget, even if you keep a few final decisions private to the very last minute.
Well, and particularly given the increasing likelihood that a lot of it is leaked to the press in advance, it kind of makes even more of a mockery of it. So do you think that has kind of affected the sort of transparency and scrutiny in Scotland as well, where obviously there's a budget process that the Scottish Government goes through, but then there's additional Barnett consequences as a result of the budget that basically doesn't come under the same level of scrutiny as a result?
I think that, I mean, I heard the discussions earlier about the legal challenges to certain bills and acts and so on, and that's obviously an issue. But I think the biggest casualty of poor intergovernmental relations over recent times has been the ability of the Scottish Government to set a budget in the full knowledge of what's going on, and to do that timely in a way that can be scrutinised in Scotland. And my two immediate priorities as Finance Minister in 1999, appointed 25 years ago on the 17th of May, about the anniversary is just coming up. The two things I was told that day were my absolute top priorities were, one, to get the Budget and Finance Act through the Scottish Parliament, to make sure we had a system for budgeting and a system for audit before the autumn, so that we could actually have our first budget that winter. And secondly, to get the memorandum of agreement between the Scottish Executive/Government and the UK Government departments, again agreed before the end of the year. And there was a reason for that, because we had to function properly, and we wanted the Scottish Parliament to function properly, not just the Scottish Government. And I think if the Scottish Parliament is going to scrutinise the budget properly, the Scottish Government needs to know the financial parameters within which it's budgeting. And I don't think that is working as well as it should.
Absolutely. So I'm not going to touch on the intergovernmental relations at official level, because I think you've covered that well, and I think actually our Civil Service in Scotland inquiry, I think you've said some interesting thoughts for us to take away for that. But the new IGR framework as we look forward was introduced in 2022. Now, you know, the GMC, during COVID, we've done inquiries on this as a committee as well. Basically, it really showed how unfit for purpose it was, because just simply those processes and systems weren't used. But, you know, Professor James Mitchell has said that despite the many changes, the essential nature is pretty much as it was 25 years ago. What do you think success does look like for the new framework going forward? Or do you have any faith in the new framework going forward? Or do you think that the same fundamental issues that we've discussed throughout this inquiry come to?
I think there's not been grasped. I think the two main problems with the GMC setup, and I think that's, you know, it's there in the new framework as well, is it's more about a discussion and liaison and general contact.
Yes.
Than solving disputes, and secondly, it's all behind closed doors and it's not transparent. Mm-hmm. And that allows both governments then to talk about it publicly in a way that can be disingenuous. And I would make the deliberations of whatever formal structure exists transparent, and then secondly, I would make it as it could never be absolutely deliberative. For reasons partly of what Elish was talking about in terms of the role of the court deliberating who's got legal responsibility and so on. But I think it could be, it would be more deliberative if it was more transparent. And I think the purpose should be to try and resolve disputes or negotiate proper formal agreements. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, we never... Looking back to 2004 in the transport decision, for example, when it was decided that the Scottish, that the UK government would add into the devolution settlement railway infrastructure alongside the services that we'd had responsibility for before, that was just an agreement between me and Alistair Darling. It wasn't. I mean, it was reported to the Scottish Parliament. We then put a bill through and so on and so forth. But there was never a GMC meeting to agree that this was change to the '98 Act would happen. And I think that, to me, that. There should be a structure that does formal stuff, and that can be dispute resolution and it can be formal agreements that have been negotiated. But I don't think beyond that it's good to create structures that inhibit the political relationships that actually make things happen.
Back to that flexibility. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Lord McConnell.
Thank you. Just lastly, obviously today's quite a big day, as you've mentioned and referenced on a couple of occasions. Yep. 25 years since the Scottish Parliament opened, and obviously we were one of the pioneers, first Finance Minister and elected that day too. We're now going into a new era, and we're obviously looking forward to seeing what comes. Off that journey, what would be your advice to the new First Minister who's just been installed today? What would you say to him about the job and the challenges that lay ahead? I know you know John Swinney very well as leader of the opposition when you were your time in First Minister. What would you say to him today as he seeks to lead a new administration?
I have to say, being the first Finance Minister would have been enough of an honour for me. But it was an incredible honour and privilege to be First Minister for nearly 6 years. And to be so and be in that position when I was relatively young and different from the others in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland at the time. But I had something in my head all the time that I was First Minister. On the night before the formal opening of the Scottish Parliament on the 1st of July 1999, the rock band Garbage played in Princess Street Gardens, and Shirley Manson, the singer, said from the stage, she was pointing up to the old Assembly building up on the hill, and she said, "I've got one message for everybody up there who's going to meet tomorrow and formally open the Scottish Parliament, and it's this song," and it was "Don't Let Me Down." And that's a good, if you're First Minister of Scotland, that's a good thing to remember. People don't want you to let them down.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much. I knew this would be a fascinating and fun session, and I think we've got lots of very good and useful evidence for our report, which hopefully we'll share with you and hopefully you'll enjoy and appreciate. But for this afternoon, Lord McConnell, thank you very much for your attendance and your participation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.